Welcome back to the Investing Talk podcast. Today we were looking at a company, TER, Teradyne,
Teradyne, yeah.
making waves, I'd say, in the semiconductor and robotics industries.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's interesting that Teradyne is not just riding this wave, right? They're actually helping to create it. They're playing a crucial role in making sure the quality and the performance of the semiconductors
Yeah.
that power our, crazy tech-driven world is up to par.
They're not messing around. Their Q4 2024 earnings report,
Yeah.
which we just got on January 29th, 2025, crushed expectations.
Totally. It really did. I mean, their earnings per share EPS
Right.
landed at 0.95, which beat analyst estimates of 0.91.
Yeah.
And I know that doesn't sound like a huge difference, but just think about this. That's a big jump from the $1.79 EPS in the same quarter last year.
So they're showing really strong and consistent growth. I mean, that's got to be a good sign for investors, right?
Absolutely. Consistent performance like that builds confidence in the market. And when you combine that with a great industry outlook, like we are seeing with semiconductors, well, Teradyne is sitting pretty.
Yeah. And speaking of looking pretty, their revenue also blew past what anyone thought it would be,
Exactly.
hitting $752.9 million
Wow.
compared to the projected $740.9 million.
It's a clear indicator. I mean, these numbers, just how strong Teradyne really is. And in fact, I think this strong performance probably, is a big reason why we've seen the recent positive price movements in the stock.
Okay, so we've established that Teradyne is doing well, but what about the bigger picture? I mean, what is happening with the semiconductor test market in general?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting because the semiconductor test market is expected to see, real accelerated growth over the next few years.
Look, that sounds great, but can you give me the specifics? What kind of growth are we talking about here?
Sure. So JP Morgan analyst Samik Chatterjee estimates that Teradyne's total addressable market, TAM, will reach $6.4 billion in 2025. Wow.
And then, get this, jump to $7.6 billion in 2026.
Yeah, that's massive. But how much of that pie can Teradyne really get?
Well, Chatterjee's analysis suggests that Teradyne is in a great spot for some big-time growth. He's predicting low 20% revenue growth in 2025 and then high 20% growth in 2026.
Wow.
If these numbers are right, Teradyne is going to be a major player in this market expansion.
So they're more than riding the wave, it seems.
Right.
Are there any specific factors driving this growth besides just general market trends?
Oh, absolutely. Teradyne is really well positioned to take advantage of some key things happening in the industry. For instance, they're likely to gain a bigger share of the verification IPA-SiC market, and they're also expected to expand their presence in the high bandwidth memory market, which is growing super fast.
Okay, let's zoom back in on Teradyne's Q4 2024 revenue for a sec. We know it was a record-breaking $752.9 million, but where did all that money come from?
Right.
Was it all semiconductors, or did they have other areas contributing as well? Well, their semiconductor test segment was the big kahuna, bringing in $561 million.
Wow, that's over half of their revenue.
I know.
What about the robotics segment? How did that do?
Robotics, contributed a solid $98 million, which isn't anything to sneeze at, for sure.
No, not at all. That's great. So it seems like they are not putting all their eggs in one basket,
Yeah.
which I think is a good thing for investors. Do we have any insight into their projections going forward?
Yes. They provided some guidance for Q1 2025. They are saying that they project revenue to be somewhere between $660 million to $700 million. And that's a pretty healthy range, even if it is a typically slower quarter.
And what about their bottom line? What is the projected net income looking like?
Well, their GAAP net income for Q1 2025 is projected to be between 0.48 cents and 7.59 cents per diluted share. So they're keeping a strong profit margin.
Okay, so we've seen that Teradyne's numbers are looking good. Now let's get into what the experts are saying.
Okay.
What is JP Morgan's overall outlook on Teradyne?
JP Morgan, they're bullish, really bullish. Analyst Samik Chatterjee, who we talked about earlier, upgraded their rating on Teradyne
Okay.
from neutral to overweight on December 17th, 2024.
Yeah, that's a pretty big show of support.
Yeah.
Did he give any specific reasons for the upgrade?
He did. He specifically highlighted the anticipated acceleration in the semiconductor test market as the main reason he is so optimistic.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that Teradyne is going to be, a real force in this rapidly growing area.
It seems like everyone is betting on the semiconductor industry right now. Okay, so we've covered the fundamentals, we've covered the expert opinions.
Right.
But what do the charts say? What are the technical indicators looking like for Teradyne?
Well, When we look at the technicals, things aren't quite as straightforward.
Hmm.
There are some mixed signals we have to look at closely.
Interesting. Well, let's unpack those a little. What's the stock price at right now, and where does that put them in their 52-week range?
As of February 3rd, 2025, Teradyne stock closed at $115.08. Now that is below their 52-week high of $163.27, which might mean there's some room for it to go up.
Okay, potentially some growth there.
Right.
What about the relative strength index, or RSI? What does that tell us?
Well, the 14-day RSI is sitting at 40.76 right now. This is telling us that the stock isn't overbought or oversold, but it is leaning a little bit toward being oversold.
Okay, so maybe not time to buy a ton, but
Okay.
could be a good entry point for people who think it's going to grow long term.
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. However, we need to look at the other indicators too.
Mm.
Let's move on to the MACD, which is short for Moving Average Convergence Divergence. It's a momentum indicator that gives us an idea of potential buy and sell signals.
And what is the MACD telling us about Teradyne?
Well, the MACD 1226 is at 0.05 right now, and that suggests a slight bullish trend, which seems to go against what the RSI told us.
Yeah.
So, mixed signals here.
Interesting. So it seems like the technical indicators are not really making things clear. What about the Bollinger Bands? Did they give us any insight?
Now, here's where we see a potential warning sign. Both the 25-day and 100-day Bollinger Bands are showing sell signals, and this could mean that there's going to be some downward pressure on the stock price, at least in the short term.
Okay, that's a little concerning. How should investors understand these mixed signals? Should they be worried about those sell signals, or are the fundamentals strong enough to not worry about them?
It's really important to remember that technical indicators are just one part of the picture. We always need to consider them alongside the fundamentals, the market in general, and of course your own goals as an investor and your risk tolerance.
Great point. Investing is complicated, and what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly.
All right, we've covered a lot here. We've seen that Teradyne is doing great. The semiconductor market looks like it's going to grow a lot. And JP Morgan is very optimistic about the company's future. But we've also got those mixed signals from the technical indicators.
It's complicated. It's important for people to really do their research before they make any decisions.
Before we move on to talk about the competition and the robotics segment, let's take a little break. When we come back, we will dig deeper into all that and what it means for Teradyne's future, and even more importantly, what it means for you as an investor. Stay tuned.
It's like trying to put a puzzle together, right?
Yeah.
You got all these pieces of information, the fundamentals and technical indicators and the industry trends, and you got to put it all together to see the full picture.
And right now, some of those pieces seem to be fitting together pretty well, while others, I don't know,
Yeah,
they're making me scratch my head a little bit.
totally. So with all of that in mind, what do you think this means for someone who is thinking about putting some money into Teradyne?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But before we get into any recommendations, let's talk about the competition. Teradyne is not the only company doing this, right?
No, definitely not. The semiconductor testing equipment market is actually very competitive. Teradyne's main rivals are companies like Advantest, Cohu, and Xcerra.
Right.
And each of these companies has its own strengths and weaknesses, of course.
So it's a pretty crowded space. But from what we've seen so far, it seems like Teradyne is holding its own and even pulling ahead in some areas.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Teradyne has a great reputation for being innovative and having high-quality products. They've invested a lot in research and development, which has helped them stay ahead of the game.
Makes sense.
And their performance lately, especially those Q4 earnings, shows that their strategy is working.
That is reassuring to hear. Now, we've talked a lot about Teradyne's semiconductor business, but I know that they're also pretty big in the robotics industry too, right? What's going on there?
Yeah, so their industrial automation group, which includes Universal Robots, Mobile Industrial Robots, and AutoGuide Mobile Robots, is doing some really cool stuff in the collaborative robot space, or cobots, as they're often called.
Cobots, huh? What exactly are cobots, and how are they different from, regular industrial robots?
So traditional industrial robots are usually big, caged-off machines designed to do just one task over and over. Cobots are different.
Right.
They are smaller, more adaptable, and meant to work right alongside humans in a shared workspace.
That sounds kind of like, I don't know, science fiction. But seriously, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So Teradyne is involved in both, I guess you could say, the brains of automation with their semiconductor testing equipment, and the Brawn with their collaborative robots.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
And, it's important to remember that their robotics business is a big part of their growth story. It's not just some, side project.
Right, so they're not putting all their eggs in one basket. They've got
Yeah.
this whole other area for growth with robotics.
Yep.
Smart move, especially considering how much demand there is for automation these days.
Absolutely. I mean, the need for automation is only going to get bigger in the next few years. I mean, businesses are always looking for ways to be more efficient, cut costs and make things safer, and robotics offers a good solution for that.
This kind of goes back to something you said earlier about how Teradyne's two main business segments kind of work together. It's like a win-win, where the success of one helps the other one grow too.
Exactly. The more sophisticated automation gets, the more demand there will be for advanced semiconductors to run those systems. And Teradyne is in a perfect spot to benefit from both sides.
Okay, let's switch gears back to investing for a minute. We've seen how well Teradyne is doing financially. We talked about their competition, and we touched on the robotics side of things. But what's the bottom line for investors? What do you think about Teradyne as an investment?
Well, I think based on everything we've talked about, I would say that Teradyne is a solid hold for investors who already own the stock.
Hold, okay. So not a screaming buy, but not a sell either. Why is that your recommendation?
Teradyne has huge potential. I mean, especially with all the good things happening in both semiconductors and robotics. And their performance has been great, and they're in a really good spot in those key growth markets. However, we can't ignore those sell signals from the Bollinger Bands either. We got to be cautious and watch how the stock does over the next few weeks.
So a wait-and-see approach for now.
Mhm.
What are some specific things that investors should be looking for to make a more informed decision?
A few things come to mind. First, pay attention to what the stock price is doing.
Okay.
If it breaks through those resistance levels, that could be a good sign.
Right.
Second, keep an eye on the RSI. If it dips down even further into oversold territory, that might be a good time to buy, especially for people looking to get in. And finally, stay up to date on any news or developments about Teradyne and the semiconductor and robotics industries in general.
Great advice. And as always, we always want to remind our listeners to do their own research and maybe talk to a financial advisor before making any big investment decisions.
That's so important. Investing is a personal thing, and it's really important to make decisions that make sense for you.
Speaking of personal journeys, I am curious to hear your take on the bigger impact of automation.
Yeah.
We've talked about Teradyne's role, but it's pretty obvious that automation is changing a lot of industries.
Right.
What are your thoughts on this, and what do you think it means for the future of, jobs and work?
That's a great question. There's no doubt that automation is changing the way we work.
Yeah.
Some jobs will definitely disappear, but others will be created.
Right.
I think the key is to adapt, to learn the skills that will be needed for those new jobs.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not necessarily all bad. It's
Mm.
more about, I guess, a shift in the kinds of skills that will be valuable.
Exactly. And I think it's not just about, technical skills, things like creativity, critical thinking, being able to solve problems, and emotional intelligence. All of those will be even more important as things become more automated.
So you're saying we're headed towards a future where humans and machines work together.
Right.
Each one doing what they're best at to achieve a common goal.
Exactly. It's an exciting time, really.
Yeah.
We are in a technological revolution.
It is pretty amazing.
And companies like Teradyne are leading the way.
Yeah, it's fascinating for sure. But for now, let's get back to talking about Teradyne. We've covered how they're doing, who they're competing with, their robotic stuff, and even the big picture of automation.
Right.
But before we finish up, I want to go back to a point you made earlier, those sell signals from the Bollinger Bands. How worried should investors be about those? And what can they do to manage the risk?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
You should definitely be aware of those sell signals, but they don't always mean the price is going to drop. Like we've been talking about, technical indicators are just one piece of information. You have to look at everything. Teradyne's fundamentals, the positive outlook for their industry, and the overall market.
So don't panic and sell just because a couple of lines on a chart are pointing down.
Exactly. Those kinds of knee-jerk reactions are almost never a good idea when it comes to investing.
Right.
Take a step back, review all the information, and think about your investment goals and how much risk you're comfortable with. If you believe in Teradyne for the long haul and are okay with a little bit of volatility, those sell signals might not be a big deal.
So a more thoughtful, level-headed approach is better.
Yeah.
For people who already own Teradyne, is it just a matter of holding on and seeing what happens?
For the most part, yes. But there are things you can do to manage risk. like setting a stop-loss order, which would automatically sell your shares if the stock price drops below a certain point.
Okay.
That can help minimize losses if the market takes a sudden turn.
That's a good strategy, especially if you're not a big risk taker. Always good to have a plan.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've given our listeners a really thorough look at Teradyne and whether it's a good investment or not. But before we wrap up completely, do you have any last thoughts or insights you want to leave us with?
I think the big takeaway here is that Teradyne is a really interesting company operating in these, fast-moving and changing industries. They're in a good position to grow, but like with any investment, there are risks to consider. It's crucial to do your homework, stay up to date, and make choices that fit your situation.
Great advice. Now, before we say goodbye, I want to remind our listeners that what we talked about today is just for educational purposes and should not be taken as financial advice. You should always talk to a financial expert before making any investment decisions.
Absolutely. It is so important to get advice that is specifically for you.
Absolutely. It's so important.
Mm.
So to wrap things up on Teradyne, I think it's safe to say that they're a company to keep your eye on.
Yeah.
They have a great track record. They're in these exciting industries that are growing like crazy, and they're making the right moves to set themselves up for success in the long run.
I totally agree. And what's really cool about Teradyne is that they're all about innovation. They're not just sitting back and doing the same old thing. They're always pushing the limits in both semiconductor testing and robotics.
That's right. And you see that innovative spirit everywhere,
Yeah.
from their advanced testing equipment to those collaborative robots. It's clear they're not afraid to try new tech and think outside the box.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking is essential. I mean, the world is changing so fast.
Yeah.
If you're not innovating, you're going to get left behind.
And it seems like Teradyne is not just keeping up with the changes, but actually ahead of them.
I'd say so. Their dedication to research and development is really impressive, and it's a big reason why they're so successful.
So for those investors out there who are looking for companies that are pushing technology forward and shaping the future, Teradyne seems like a good bet.
I think so. They're definitely worth watching. And as we've been discussing, their involvement in both semiconductors and robotics gives them a real edge in this whole automation thing that's getting bigger all the time.
All right, so let's bring it all together.
Yeah.
We've gone over Teradyne's numbers, how they stack up against their competitors, their robotics work, and even the big picture of what automation means. What's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the main point is that Teradyne has a ton of potential. But, and this is important, as with any investment, you've got to do your research, understand the risks and the rewards, and make smart decisions that make sense for you.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Teradyne.
It was great being here.
And remember, if you like this episode, make sure to subscribe to the Investing Talk podcast. We've got more great conversations coming up about the companies that are changing the world. And if you really liked it, tell a friend, share it with your family, anyone you think might be interested in learning more about Teradyne.
Thanks for listening, everyone.